The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and thanks for joining our online fraud prevention webinar this morning. I am delighted to be joined by Martin Budd, who's one of F5's anti-fraud specialists, who will be discussing today how businesses can protect their revenue, brand and customers' assets as well from online fraud, which is a massively increasing issue at the moment. Just to give you a very quick overview of what we're going to be discussing on the webinar today. So as I said, what we want to do is give our customers insight into handling online fraud, protecting their assets and customers from online fraud activities, and a bit of a background into solutions that will help those businesses mitigate against online fraud. Brief agenda: I will give a very brief Bytes introduction, most of you will know us already. I will discuss why online fraud is increasing severity before introducing our presenter, Martin. Martin will take us through how online fraud has developed, how the web protection solutions F5 have to help, and also mobile protection solutions. Apparently, oh, my audio has gone. I've been informed my audio is gone, so I'm going to try and get it back.
Yeah, you're back.
Am I back? So apologies about that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, people, for letting me know. Hopefully you can hear me. I will keep this very short then in case my audio drops again. So as I was saying, I'll give a very brief Bytes intro, hand over to Martin, who will cover web anti-fraud protection, mobile anti-fraud protection, and before we launch into an interactive Q&A. He'll also give a bit of background into recent online fraud trends. So then just a very little bit of housekeeping for today. Attendee lines are on mute. However, questions are welcome and we'll be monitoring questions. Please post them via the questions. It's how I knew my audio had gone. Someone had put that for me. We'll do a Q&A at the end and address any of those questions. So I'll pose all your questions to Martin. In terms of the webinar today, we will keep the webinar to technical discussions, not commercials or financials. Of course, further discussion on anything that spikes your interest is welcome with our account managers, but what we want to do today is talk about problems and solutions rather than any particular commercials. Lastly, there is a survey at the end. Please do fill it in so we can ensure these sessions continue to stay relevant and hit the mark, and we'll also provide a recording that will be available for you post-webinar to share with your wider business. So a little bit about Bytes. We're part of the 2.3 billion Altron Group, who floated on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and within the UK, the Bytes technology group is comprised of two main companies. Bytes Software Services, who are the large part of our organisation. They are the biggest Microsoft value-added reseller in the UK, and they specialise in software licensing and asset management across varied different infrastructure solutions, Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, etc., etc. And secondarily, there's Bytes Security Partnerships. So we are the network security specialist company within the group. We focus solely on security solutions and provide not just licensing and software support, but also hardware and consultancy support for our customers around those solutions. A little bit about us. We were bought by Bytes 4 years ago now, and since acquisition we've worked hard to combine the agility and specialism of that small independent reseller with some of the assets and the backing of a large group that we can give to customers now. Key things to note is we're absolutely passionate about security education. It's the reason we run regular informative sessions such as today, and also seminars. We also, another key thing to note is that 50% of our employees are actually technical, so we are fully kitted up to support and provide consultancy around the solutions that we work with, one of which is F5. So that's enough about us. What's occurring? Why have we decided to talk to you about online fraud? Well, the problem's increasing. Last year and this year has been almost 100 billion lost due to fraudulent activities, and customers and businesses in your sector, in financial services, retail and banking, are particular targets. So it's really relevant for us to be talking to anyone who trades online about this at the moment. The methods that the bad guys or bad actors use are increasing in complexity and variety. Martin will share some of these later, so it's really important to be updated on what these fraudulent fraudsters are trying to achieve. Lastly, you know, businesses in these sectors have a need and a mandate to protect their customers' information as well as their own revenues, both whether they're using web or mobile-based transactions. So why have we gathered you here today, so to speak? Well, we want to essentially introduce how you can respond to that challenge. F5 have varied anti-fraud solutions which can protect against both traditional and more targeted advanced threats. And today we want to share with you how you can, some strategies, some solutions that you can use in order to protect your business. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Martin. I'm hoping his audio is much better than mine. Apologies for the short delay at the start. Martin will take you through the crux of the presentation today before questions and answers. Over to Martin.
Thanks, Shanna. So hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Please, if there are any audio issues, continue to use the message or chat just to let us know that there's issues, and we'll try and get those resolved for you. So thank you for your time this morning. My name's Martin Budd. I'm the Security Sales Manager for UK, Ireland and South Africa for F5. And as Shona mentioned, really key objective for today is to kind of look at the evolution of digital fraud and why traditional approaches are kind of failing, and to look at what or the threats that modern malware poses to organizations. So if we kind of look, you know, Sun Tzu had a great quote, roughly translated, that said, you know, nothing is more critical and difficult than the art of constantly evolving our defenses against emergent threats. And if we look at it fundamentally, whether we tackle the fraud space or whether we look at kind of traditional security approaches, the threats we face today have changed almost unrecognizably, and yet we're still reliant on fundamental principles for security technologies which simply can't keep pace with the threats we're seeing today. So F5 has a kind of multi-service security platform. I'm not going to touch on the broader portfolio through the presentation, but it's just useful to get some context about how we deliver this. For us, it's essentially we brought the anti-fraud solutions into the same platform, enabling us to deliver kind of application, what we call application kind of access and application protection services into a single platform, now also capable of delivering anti-fraud solutions as well. So if we kind of look at the evolution, you know, why is malware such a problem now, and why is it having such a prolific effect on the fraud risks we're all facing and trying to deal with? Fundamental biggest change we've seen is just the way we deliver applications. Whether we're looking at kind of a traditional banking organization, whether we're looking at an e-commerce organization or any other industry we can think of, there has been a fundamental shift to web enabling of applications. You know, the biggest access method into any application footprint now is now the customer browser. And traditionally, we've done a really good job of creating a secure data center environment. We brought in lots of security components, lots of security controls, protecting the application or the server side of our core assets. You know, the fraudsters have become wise, and the hackers and the bad guys have become wise to this, and ultimately they've just shifted the focus of their target, you know, moving away from the data center, which is relatively well protected today, and actually focusing on the weakest link. And ultimately the weakest link is kind of the customer. You know, if we think about it today, a simple analogy is, you know, why do you go and try and rob the vault in a bank when you can actually get the guys going in one by one as they make the deposits into the bank? So the approach is kind of the same. The low-hanging fruit from an attack footprint perspective is actually the customer. If we think about malware in general, you know, today we've approached malware to protect the enterprise. So most of you today will have some sort of solution in place, I'm sure, that's focused around protecting your own employees from actually being compromised by some sort of malware when they're protected behind the enterprise perimeter. And that's great from an employee perspective. But when we think about it, you know, the biggest touch point and the bit that actually makes our organizations money is the interaction with our customers. Traditionally, we've not been able to focus on protecting our customers and ultimately mitigating that fraud or risk from our organization. If we look at the customer browser, you know, we see a multitude of different threats. Some we're going to go through today, really around kind of man-in-the-browser attacks, keyloggers, man-in-the-middle attacks. And we're going to talk through some of these today. But the browser is effectively the weakest link. And if we think about it, you know, from a fundamental perspective, you know, no two browsers are the same. And that creates a massive vulnerability for us today. The net result of this is, you know, malware today is a daily news story. Here's kind of like 3 news articles from the last kind of couple of weeks. You know, the biggest one probably being the £20 million worth of kind of money stolen from UK banks in the last few weeks by a particular nasty strain of malware called Dridex. The interesting thing with the way the fraudsters used Dridex was that they typically took very small amounts from lots of accounts, which made it harder for the banks and also the end users or the customers of those accounts to actually detect that there was any fraud or loss actually taking place. I think the other kind of constituting factor for this in terms of why we see such an explosion in the risk is, you know, just the rate of adaptation and the ease of creating very advanced malware strains today. You know, in a study from Panda in Q1, Panda Security, they referenced that there were 225,000 new malware strains per day. Our own threat research shows that that's increased dramatically since Q1. So we're seeing a huge amount and a huge volume of new malware strains every single day. The other kind of constituting factor is just the ease of compromise of users on the internet today. Doesn't matter how tech savvy people are, whether we look at drive-by downloads, watering hole attacks, malvertising, whether you look at spear phishing, phishing attacks, the relative ease to be able to compromise large amounts of your customers is making a fundamental change in kind of where we see the market going, which is ultimately we have to assume that every one of your customers is already compromised. So it's kind of you're proven guilty unless I see you're innocent. So it's a kind of turn in the model we've used for so long where we actually believe that you're a good law-abiding citizen until proven otherwise. From a malware perspective and a fraud and a risk to your organization now, we almost need to turn the table and assume that every one of your customers is compromised in some way. So if you're not familiar with any of the terms we just mentioned there in terms of the different attack vectors, then please reference them and we'll go through some of them for you in the Q&A session later. But I think, you know, the big one that I'll just touch on briefly is kind of drive-by downloads. You know, these are particularly kind of worrying because we've now moved beyond the fact where I need to send you an attachment and the user needs to open the attachment to install something that actually contains some sort of exploit to enable me to infect the machine with malware. Drive-by downloads effectively leverage vulnerabilities in kind of browser extensions or the browser, if we're talking about a web-based channel for a moment. And effectively, just by visiting a web page, I can basically be infected. So it requires no user interaction whatsoever. So if we look at kind of a traditional kind of application workflow with how a customer would basically would navigate your site or your application. Well, typically they visit the site, they'd log in, they'd navigate around the site, and then they place a transaction. Once they place the transaction, they'd execute the transaction. And these are fairly generic steps that we can apply to any industry or any vertical. Traditionally, we've used a number of different techniques to help us overcome kind of threats we've seen in the fraud landscape at each one of these steps, from the initial device fingerprinting to understand if I've seen that user logging on that device before, to then understanding patterns to say, have I seen that user logging in from that geolocation before? Are they logging in without any failed login attempts, or are they trying to brute force the login? is the user navigation within kind of like the normalized behavior that I see for that user? And actually, am I seeing any abnormal money movement or any abnormal spending profile for that user? You know, unfortunately, modern malware now means that there are a different set of threats that bypass all of the traditional controls that we've seen. You know, before a customer even visits your site, you know, they're now subjective to large-scale kind of phishing attacks. From a site login perspective, you know, users don't necessarily, or fraudsters and hackers, brute force sites any longer to grab your login credentials if they can extract them directly out of the browser. From a navigation perspective, you know, again, if I can change the way the website is rendered, I don't necessarily have to try and manipulate anything in flight. So we'll look at some of these steps as we go through, but fundamentally the biggest takeaway from this slide is if we look at the traditional mechanisms we've got in place, they're simply not keeping pace with the threats we see today in modern malware. So from our perspective, kind of our anti-malware services are designed to present fraud, loss, or malware having an adverse effect in the way that a user interacts with your application. One of the biggest challenges is traditional anti-malware solutions have required a client-based solution. Now, client-based solutions in the enterprise world where you're trying to protect your own employees as well. But it's a different model when effectively you're asking your customers to install a client which you're mandating to protect your own organization from fraud. And what we've typically seen in the market is very, very low adoption rates, even if you do take a client-based approach. Not least because as security professionals for a very long time, we're telling customers not to install things on their laptops, and now we're asking them to do exactly that. It also introduces an interesting dynamic in terms of a care of duty to that client and what your obligations are. So if you're installing some software and the software causes a problem on the PC and the customer loses some personal data or photographs, you know, there's an interesting dynamic there about where the care of duty and responsibility lies. So our approach needs to be different. We need to be able to prevent advanced fraud and detect malware. We need to be able to protect 100% of our user base without a client. We need to be able to protect all devices, whether we're actually talking about a web-based channel from a desktop PC or a laptop or a mobile device, or whether we're talking about the mobile channel with the increasing kind of development of native mobile applications. Key part here is we need to make it transparent. So we don't want to basically have any client components or any change to the user experience, and we don't want to modify the web application at all. You know, any modification that's required in a web application means that I don't have the agility to stay ahead of modern and emerging malware threats at the rate of kind of adoption we're seeing today and adaptation we're seeing today. And the last key point is it has to be in real time. We need to be able to use this information in real time to enable us to move into a preventative mode or a proactive mitigation rather than a reactive sort of defense policy. So F5 Web Fraud Solutions control of two separate components. WebSafe, on the interest of time today, predominantly around WebSafe, although a lot of the controls are applicable across both. WebSafe effectively is our security components that exist across web channels. So any web-based application or any mobile application that ultimately uses HTTP at the back end and it just renders into a mobile app. MobileSafe is slightly different. It's designed as an SDK for you to be able to leverage our advanced security capability into your development of the mobile application itself. So focusing on kind of WebSafe. So how does this actually plug into your infrastructure? Well, many of you today, I'm sure, will be using F5 big IPs in your environment today. And as you saw on one of the earlier slides, the anti-fraud solution sits as another module, another service that you can switch on your existing platforms. Essentially, if we think about how F5 sits in the traffic flow today, you'll have your customers over on the left-hand side, accessing an application through the big IP appliance. Okay, the traffic flow with WebSafe remains exactly the same. A client will access through the big IP will send that traffic onto the application server. When the application server responds, we'll basically inject our security components back into the response that's set down to the client. This is all completely transparent to the application and completely transparent to the user. Effectively, this gives us our footprint inside the browser that enables us to do very advanced kind of detection, and I'll talk about how that works as we move forward. The other kind of key components that sit within this are something that we called our alert server. So the alert server is effectively our alert dashboard. This can be integrated with kind of other risk engines you may be using, either via syslog or a web API, web services API. And effectively, the alert server are where alerts get sent. So should I detect that there's malware present on a machine, as a simplistic example, what is within the session on the client will send an alert as part of the normal application response to the big IP appliance. When the big IP appliance receives it, it will forward it to the alert server. Now, the alert server itself can either run as an on-premises solution or as a cloud-based solution hosted and run by our Security Operations Center. There is also a hybrid model available whereby you use a local alert server and you can choose to send specific alerts to the Security Operations Center, effectively using them to augment your own security and research teams to help you analyze kind of new malware, as an example. The key thing with that data flow that I've just mentioned, just to reiterate, is we inject our security components, which are completely transparent to both the user and the application. And any alert that we detect, any suspicious behavior, that alert will be sent as part of the normal application flow, making it impossible, or very, very nearly impossible, for the fraudster to be able to block that kind of alert. If we send alerts out to different cloud-based kind of applications or alert servers, then it's relatively easy for the fraudster or hacker to intercept those transmissions and block them. So WebSafe comprises of 4 key components, and the 4 key components are basically there to address threats we see today as being very prevalent in techniques used in modern malware and modern digital fraud attacks. And I'm going to step through each one in a little bit more detail. WebSafe is available. You can either buy the individual modules you see here, so advanced phishing detection, malware detection, application layer encryption, or automated transaction detection, or you can buy it as a bundle comprising of all of those different components. So if we think about phishing for a second, phishing for me is really about 2 things. It's either about credential acquisition, or it's about driving a user to a location where I can infect them with malware, whether that be by tricking them to open an attachment, as an example, or whether it be a drive-by download sort of attack where just visiting the web page could compromise that client. Now, the reason why phishing is so prolific today is it's just simply because it's so easy to do. Phishing is effectively just copying a website, hosting it somewhere else, creating a fairly realistic and convincing email to basically drive users to that site. And we've seen a big change in the phishing scams today, being far more intelligent and far more kind of effective. We've moved away from the phishing scams where Uncle Stan in Nigeria is going to pay you $1 million. But phishing scams today are very, very targeted, very sophisticated, and are very, very convincing to unsuspecting users. So we see phishing working in different ways, but predominantly now, phishing is orchestrated by fraudsters or hackers that effectively just make an exact copy of your site. Gone are the days where you could create an offline static version of the website and upload it, predominantly because websites today contain lots of very dynamic content. There's lots of JavaScript that's normally obfuscated, lots of dynamic objects, graphics that are referred from a different domain, etc. So it's extremely difficult to build a website offline that looks exactly the same. So today the biggest kind of approach we see to phishing is effectively just a copy. So in this example, an attacker will basically visit the real website. Once he's visited the real website, he will save a copy to their own web server. Normally he'll save it locally and then he'll upload it to a kind of hosted cloud-based kind of web server. What he'll then do is send a fairly convincing email out to all of your customers, ultimately driving your customers to that phished site. Once the victim visits that phished site, they'll enter their login credentials as they normally do, and actually then what actually happens at the back end is those credentials are normally sent to a drop zone or CNC server, exposing those credentials that have been acquired to the fraudster or the hacker. So how do we deal with this? Well, we've approached it in a slightly different way. So there's traditional approaches that everyone's used for years with dealing with phishing attacks. And these are to kind of look at referrers, to look at domain registrations, to use honeypots, and various other techniques that you'll all be familiar with to spot the creation of phishing attacks. Now, we leverage all of those mechanisms as well, but we've taken a fundamentally different approach to dealing with what we see as modern kind of phishing attacks. So firstly, if we look at the same thing, when a fraudster in this case visits the website and they copy it, essentially the traffic flows back through the big IP and the WebSafe components. Effectively, when they download that website, they're actually downloading our security components along with them. So when they save a copy and upload it to a kind of hosting platform, as an example, we'll get an initial alert to tell us that that site has now been created somewhere it shouldn't exist. The next thing that's likely to happen is the fraudster is going to log into that site to check their own bit of script is working correctly, and when they log in, the credentials are sent to the drop zone that they're sending those credentials to. Again, if we see a login into that site that exists somewhere it shouldn't be, we'll create a higher severity log to basically tell you that not only has that site been stood up where it shouldn't be, we've now seen a login on that fake site. Because our security components are running along with that kind of phished site, what we're also able to do is actually pull out the username of the user that logged into that site. This is significant because if the fraudster acts quickly and manages to send out a phishing email and gets to a large number of your customers, effectively if a customer is tricked into logging into the phished site, we'll be able to pull back the username of that user. That means you can take mitigating controls within your own systems to make sure that that user's account and details aren't compromised in any way. If we think about it from a phishing perspective as well, it's also worth being sensitive to the fact that phishing is a lot broader than it used to be site or on a lot. We see a big shift today of phishing attacks targeting SSL VPN devices. Organizations, if they're not using two-factor authentication, their SSL VPN will be linked to AD. Compromising those credentials, going back to the credential acquisition kind of use, effectively means that that fraudster now has AD credentials for that user. That's a significant value to that hacker and a significant security. So the other thing to mention around kind of our detection capability is once we detect a phished attack, we have a whole host of SOC phishing takedown services run by our security operations centers, where specialists within the SOC are responsible for taking down that phishing site. And because of our advanced detection capability, they're generally able to take down phishing sites before they become a problem for your customers. Second kind of core threat we see is just being able to detect kind of malware on the machine. Malware now is very, very prolific. There's different types of malware. We refer to them as generic malware that exists that may not be targeting your organization, and targeted malware that may be targeting your organization. So if we kind of look at one of the biggest things that malware is doing today to kind of, again, elicit credentials, we talk about, now the interesting thing is once we have malware inside the browser, effectively now it's able to render any scripts, change the look and feel of the web page as it's rendered to the user, and effectively capture credentials, and we'll go through all of these use cases in the next few slides. So web injection is really, really prolific, and we've all seen examples of this in the news, I'm sure. With web injection, the interesting dynamic here is I am a legitimate user talking to the legitimate website with a valid SSL certificate in place, or SSL session in place. I can check the validity of the certificate and everything will be fine because I'm talking to the real site. That creates an interesting dynamic because that's kind of all of the good practice stuff that we've tried to educate our users on for years. Make sure you're talking to the right site, make sure SSL is in place. In this example, I am talking to the legitimate web application. But because the malware has a hook within the browser, it's able to effectively inject its own scripts or content into that browser. So in this example, I visit a bank, I have my login and password field as normal, but the malware basically injects another field into that web page, basically asking me for my ATM PIN. Okay, here's 3 more examples, not to pick on these 3 guys, but these were 3 kind of live instances of malware that was targeting them. And again, you can see it's all about gaining that sensitive information pertinent to those sites. So asking you for your mother's maiden name or your PIN or other sensitive parameters that could be used by the fraudsters to compromise the integrity of that account and elicit fraud against your organization. Now, again, these are examples of the footprint in the browser that enables malware to inject components. The one thing that is interesting is we have started to see an evolution in kind of, as people become more aware of these kind of security risks and as organizations do a better job of raising awareness in their customer base, we've started to see an evolution in attackers understanding logic of the application. So in this example, Zeus was used to not try and capture all of the credentials on the initial login page. Because if I go to a login page where it normally asks me for username and password, and then all of a sudden it asks me for lots of sensitive parameters, I may be suspicious as a user. What we've seen now is kind of the web logic change, or the fraudsters' attack vectors change to a point where they'll actually inject content post-login. So now as an unsuspecting user, I'm visiting the legitimate site, SSL is valid, certificates are valid, I've logged in exactly as I would normally log in, and post-login, I'm being asked for additional security information. I think if we're honest, most of us today would probably provide that information if we were asked. So how do we do? Well, there's 2 kind of strands to this from our perspective. The first one is that we leverage capability, basically identify malware traits that exist on the endpoint. And that's fairly redressing and web inject. Think about where we sat in between the browser that the user's using to access the web application. Effectively, we see the entire response from the web application. We understand what that should look like in the browser when it's rendered for the end user. Effectively, our security components are able to compare what we think or what we know the web application sent to what the end user actually sees in their browser. And if there's any difference, any change to how that web page, there is potentially malicious activity on that endpoint that we can detect and flag. So one of the other big trends we see in kind of malware today is either a man in the browser attack or a man in the middle attack within the browser. So a man in the middle attack in the browser effectively uses a web to intercept traffic between you hitting the post button. It will be able to intercept that post, manipulate, send the post down the line. Now clearly this kind of renders things that we've seen in the such as device ID is completely useless because I'm coming from a device that I've known to be legitimate in the past. Similarly, remote access Trojans, whereby somebody gets a remote kind of VNC connection onto your machine, renders things like device ID almost useless. So one of the key things to protect sensitive parameters within our application, because man in the browser give me that foothold in the browser where I can see data. Man give me a proxy where I can intercept, view, and potentially manipulate that data. So how do we deal with it? Well, the first kind of misnomer to call out is we all think that SSL gives us security for data, and it does. You know, in transit, SSL, apart from some of the significant vulnerabilities we've seen in SSL over the last 18 months or so, does a very integrity of data. When I have an HTTPS session to a website and I'm using SSL TLS, when I type in my username and password field, although the password is obscured and I may get stars as I enter the password field and it's encrypted by SSL when I out across the web, but it is available and accessible in clear text. Okay, we need some of that when we consider that modern malware into the browser, and therefore everything that happens in the browser, an attacker has infected a victim somehow. The victim website that the malware is triggered to act on. You know, typically, malware doesn't fire on every website. It will be targeted to act on specific kind of targets that they're interested in compromising. Triggers the malware to run. User enters their data into the web form. So as usual, they enter a username and password. Now, just to give you an illustration of how exposed this data is in the browser, if I hit the reveal button, I can see the kind of the password in clear text. More importantly, though, if I query the DOM within the browser, I can see that password stored in clear text. Here's a query of the DOM, so I can now see that Bob Smith was my username, input into the username field, and basically tough password was password that was then being sent to the malware are these credentials. You know, effectively, when the user submits the application, everything's great, but at the same time, those credentials are sent off to the drop zone and then exposed to the fraudster. Now, here's an example of Citadel, which is a command and control server, and in this example, you can see I've had a connection to HTTPS google.com, and here you can see that the username and the password is exposed in clear text. This is something you can demonstrate very easily yourself if you want to see this working. So how do we deal with that? Well, in this example, we've still got the user infected with malware. The way that the user accesses the application is through the big IP. So normal traffic flow is user sends a request through the big IP. We send the request to the application. We get a response from the application, and we inject our security components. Along with those security components, we effectively have a private public RSA key pair. What we then components, we basically send down the public key as part of the response to the client. Our security components run the browser and in the Effectively then, if we look at what information is exposed within the browser, we see the encrypted string rather than the clear text password. So as we start to input each character, we encrypt it using that public key. Back to the responding private key, we decrypt the password, send the clear text password to the application, and any kind of data that's sent to the drop zone is encrypted and useless to the fraudster. Here's another example where we've got our fraud protection in front of an application, and you can see here the password string that's sent to Citadel again is actually an encrypted string as I've just described. The other thing we can use is something that we call dynamic bait credentials. So these are really just a mechanism of substitution. So we inject our security components. When the user types in a password, we'll create a substitution in real time. So effectively, we take a password which is tough password. We substitute on the screen, sent to the malware, there to a drop zone. They're the credentials that are exposed to a fraudster. At that point, if a fraudster attempts to log into your web application using those compromised credentials, we can detect that not only was there malware present on the machine, not only did it steal the credentials, but just as importantly, the fraudster actually tried to log into the application using those credentials. The other thing I should mention that we'd actually do with this is one of the questions that typically comes up from this is, that's great if I look at kind of entering passwords directly into the DOM, but what happens if there's a browser-based keylogger as an example? So one of the other mitigations we have, and there's lots we could talk about, but one of the other mitigations we have is we'll index into the browser, into the keyboard buffer. So effectively, if you enter a keystroke, we'll basically enter 30 other keystrokes into it. So it will become impossible to actually extract the password element from the captured string by the keyboard buffer. One other use case for this that's kind of interesting that we see being more and more applicable is protecting sensitive data through cloud-based service providers. So, you know, if we take, for example, that more and more organizations are looking to cloud providers now as a way of providing service to their organization, one of the big security concerns is about exposing that data to a cloud-based service provider. If I'm using SSL and I need them to perform any layer 7 function, the reality is that cloud-based service provider is going to have to terminate SSL and we'll see clear text traffic. One of the use cases we've seen has been extremely popular is to use this field level encryption capability that I've just been describing, effectively to hide sensitive parameters from your cloud service providers. So an example use case is, I've got a particularly sensitive application, I want to encrypt password details, I don't want them ever to be exposed. So using these security controls in the browser, I encrypt that keystroke, that field, that password. It then hits SSL, gets sent to my cloud services provider, they decrypt SSL, they still cannot see the sensitive parameters I've encrypted using this technique. They'll do their cloud-based processing, whatever their kind of services that you procured through the cloud service provider. They then send it back into your application via the big IP, where we decrypt that sensitive parameter and send it onto the actual application. So the last kind of use case I want to touch on briefly, or the last kind of big threat we see today, is automated transaction detection. And there's a couple of kind of parts in this which are key. You know, effectively, automated transaction detection is all about ensuring that there's a real user submitting that transaction. So we use a whole load of heuristic detection techniques to identify that it's a real user at the end of that transaction that's trying to submit and perform it. So we'll use things like mouse movement, keystroke, cursor position, time of input, etc., to enable us to understand if it looks like a script or a bot that's executing that transaction. One of the other things that's interesting, if we think about kind of man in the middle attacks that I spoke about earlier, which are becoming more prolific, where we see a proxy that sits in between the web application and, that sits between the input that you're entering as a user and the post that gets sent to the application, is we're able, because we understand the value that you input in, we're able to basically capture that. If a proxy then tries to manipulate that value, when it gets sent to the big IP, we can essentially compare the value that we know you as a user input to the value that's then been submitted to the application. And if there's a difference in those two values, we're able to detect it and take preventative action. So a simple example of this would be, I'm logged onto my legitimate banking application, I've authenticated, I've basically said that I'm going to pay my mum £100 for whatever reason, and the proxy, the malicious entity within the browser, effectively changes it so that rather than my mum becoming the account payee, it becomes a fraudster through a mule account, and rather than the amount being £100, it's £1,000, as a simple example. So by being able to compare the value we capture, the value that you as a user input versus the value that's submitted, we can identify anomalies in the way that the transaction is performed. Linked to that as well, we also, as I say, do the normal heuristic behavior analysis, but we do this in a clientless mechanism, and effectively that gives us a risk score so that we can have an overall kind of view as how risky that transaction is. And we may be able to take a decision that says, based upon that risk score, we will change the transaction limit, or we'll change the flow of that transaction based on the risk score. In terms of configuration, as I've mentioned, it's part of the kind of core Big IP platform. So for those of you that are familiar with it today, it's essentially another tab that's available to you in the Big IP configuration. It's integrated for both a MobileSafe and a WebSafe component. Very, very straightforward setup and integrated into kind of the core Big IP configuration since 11.6. Very briefly, conscious of time, I want to touch on security operation centers. So we have 2 core security operation centers with a 3rd opening in Poland, so Seattle and Tel Aviv. And really the purpose of the security operation center is really to augment the platform as we see new and emergent threats. Because of our detection techniques, some of which I've described through the webinar today, we're not reliant on just using signatures, because we look tested to keep updating signatures. But the Security Operations Center are there to deal with kind of threat research, phishing takedown, and kind of enabling organizations to leverage the expertise we have in dealing with modern malware as an extension to their own organization. So back to our kind of key starting point for this, really. I think the takeaway is, in order to deal with modern malware and the threats we see, not only across kind of financial and banking platforms, but more broadly across our organizations today, we have to have a different way of dealing with the threats that we see. We have to have a clientless solution that enables us to inject comprehensive security controls, not only to detect, but potentially to take preventative kind of blocking action on transactions or individual user accounts. So I think with that, managing to stick roughly to time, that concludes the presentation.
Thank you very much.
Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me, Martin? Can you hear me, Martin?
I can, yes.
Oh, fabulous.
Yes.
Okay, so with that in mind, I'd just like to invite the audience to pose any questions regarding any of the solutions or methods that Martin's presented today. And I'll sort of leave it a minute or so to answer any questions, so we can kick off some conversations and questions from the audience. Please do post those questions via the questions box, and I'll pose them to Martin over the next minute or so. Okay, I'll just give it 30 more seconds for anyone to... Oh, I do have one question, apologies, from the audience. So we've got a question regarding the security components you mentioned. Can you just provide some clarity on what the security components are, Martin?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So, yeah, the way we kind of apply our security components is, as we see that return traffic flow from the application, we inject kind of highly obfuscated JavaScript back into the response that goes back to the client, which then gets processed within the browser context. Effectively, we use lots and lots of complex kind of protection mechanisms within that JavaScript insertion. So we create different dynamic insertion points. So we randomize how we use the obfuscation mechanisms to kind of keep them constantly changing. We also have lots of countermeasures within an almost fail-safes within the JavaScript. So we insert it in multiple components, and if a fraudster tried to remove kind of elements of the JavaScript, the other kind of elements of JavaScript that remained on the page would detect their removal and basically trigger alerts. The other thing that's kind of key to understand from a kind of protection mechanism perspective is because the big IP sits in the data path, it knows that we injected the security components when it went back into the client. If we then see a response back from your user that doesn't have any security components present, and we know we injected them, that in itself will give us an indication that something nefarious has happened to that kind of endpoint or that user, and therefore we can take kind of a stance in terms of how we treat that transactional user.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. That certainly answers that. I'll just give a couple of seconds for any other questions. Otherwise, I'd like to thank Martin very much for his time today in presenting, and thank you all as well for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us this morning. Once again, just to reiterate, there is a brief survey at the end, so if you could take a minute to fill it in, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, thank you all for your time and good morning.
Thanks very much.